My wife asked for a divorce. She said, I want the house, the cars, everything except the son. My lawyer begged me to fight. I said, give it all to her. Everyone thought I'd lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed everything over. As if she didn't know I'd already won, she smiled, until her lawyer turned pale when. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. The house stood at the end of Sycamore Lane, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and the street signs stopped pretending anyone was coming through. Maple Run, Ohio, wasn't the kind of place people moved to on purpose. It was where they landed, settled, and convinced themselves that small-town stability was what they'd wanted all along. Daniel Hargreave had bought the place 12 years ago with money he'd saved from 3 jobs and a Veterans Affairs loan he'd qualified for after his 4 years in the Army. The house had good bones, his father had said, walking through it with hands on hips like he was inspecting a recruit. Good bones meant you could fix the rest yourself, which Daniel had. Replaced the roof, repaired the porch, rewired half the electrical system on weekends while Lydia sat inside with her sister, drinking wine and talking about neighborhoods with better schools. Now he sat at the kitchen table, coffee gone cold in front of him, watching the dishwasher cycle through its final rinse. The machine hummed and clicked, water sloshing inside like something living. Outside, the September wind pushed leaves against the window and dry, scratching sounds. Lydia stood near the sink, arms crossed, waiting. She'd been waiting for 20 minutes, ever since Noah's bus pulled away and the house fell into that particular kind of silence that only exists between two people who've run out of things to say. I don't want to be married anymore, she said. Daniel's hand stayed wrapped around the mug. The ceramic had gone lukewarm, the heat bleeding out the same way warmth had left this kitchen months ago. He looked at her, really looked. Her hair was different, lighter at the ends. She'd been going to a salon in the next town over. He'd noticed the charges on the credit card but hadn't asked about them. Okay, he said. Lydia blinked. Her arms tightened across her chest, defensive posture clicking into place like she'd expected him to argue. Maybe she wanted him to argue. But Daniel had learned a long time ago, back when he was 19 and standing in a sandstorm outside Kandahar, that some fights couldn't be won by charging forward. Sometimes you dug in. You waited. You let the storm pass over you and saw what remained after. I want the house, she continued, voice steadier now. Practiced. She'd rehearsed this, probably with her sister, maybe with that new friend from her book club, the one who'd gone through her own divorce last year and seemed to think she was some kind of expert on freedom. The SUV, the savings account. I need stability. Daniel nodded slowly, his thumb tracing the handle of his mug. He could see his reflection in the dark coffee, distorted and small. Lydia uncrossed her arms. Her fingers fidgeted with her wedding ring, twisting it but not removing it. Not yet. You could take care of Noah. The words hung in the air like smoke. Their son was 10 years old. He collected baseball cards with the intensity of an archaeologist, organizing them in protective sleeves, memorizing stats like they mattered more than anything else in the world. He still asked Daniel to check under his bed before sleeping. Still needed the hallway light on because the dark felt too big. Daniel's throat tightened. He felt something shift in his chest, something sharp and cold, but his face didn't change. His voice stayed level. If that's what you want. Lydia stared at him. He could see the confusion in her eyes, the tiny crack in her confidence. She'd expected tears, shouting, bargaining. The script in her head probably had him begging her to stay, promising to change, to be better, to finally become whatever version of himself she'd decided he should have been. Instead, Daniel stood up. He carried his mug to the sink and rinsed it under lukewarm water, soap suds forming in small, temporary bubbles. The faucet squeaked when he turned it off. He'd been meaning to replace the washer for months. I'll call a lawyer on Monday, he said, setting the mug in the dish rack. We can keep this simple. For Noah. Lydia's mouth opened, closed. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but the moment had passed. Daniel walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor they'd installed together 5 years ago, back when they still made plans that stretched into decades. The attorney's office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. Cliff Renner had practiced family law in Maple Run for 30 years, which meant he'd seen every kind of divorce this town could produce. He sat behind a desk stacked with manila folders, reading the settlement terms Lydia's attorney had drafted. "She's overreaching," Cliff said, tossing the papers down. His reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck, and he rubbed the bridge of his nose like the document had given him a headache. Full custody of the child, the house, the vehicle, and 80% of marital assets. "You'll regret giving this up." Daniel sat across from him in a chair that had seen better decades. Through the window behind Cliff's head, he could see Main Street, where the pharmacy and the diner and the hardware store sat in a row like they'd been there since before anyone could remember. Probably had been. "She's already decided how this ends," Daniel said. Fighting would only drag Noah through it. Cliff leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "This isn't generosity. This is surrender. You're a veteran. You worked your ass off for that house, and she's taking everything while handing you the responsibility of raising your son like it's a burden she's doing you a favor by letting you carry." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "No, this is containment." "Containment?" Cliff frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the papers on the desk, at Lydia's demands written out in neat legal language that made taking a man's life apart sound reasonable. Equitable distribution, sole physical custody, primary residence. Words that meant she got to walk away with the result of 15 years while he got to start over with their son and whatever fit in the back of his truck. "It means I'm choosing my battles," Daniel said finally. "I give her what she wants now, and she can't come back later asking for more. Clean break. No drawn-out custody fight. No allegations. No making Noah choose sides in a courtroom." Cliff studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're either the most strategic bastard I've ever met or the biggest fool." "Maybe both," Daniel said. Cliff sighed and picked up a pen. "All right, but when this blows up in your face, don't say I didn't warn you." "I won't," Daniel replied, because he knew something Cliff didn't, something Lydia didn't. He'd spent the last 6 months preparing for this conversation, for this moment. While Lydia had been pulling away, staying late at work, texting her sister in that particular way people do when they're building the courage to burn their life down, Daniel had been reading, researching, organizing. He'd worked with a financial advisor 2 towns over, someone Lydia had never met. He'd quietly closed joint accounts she'd forgotten existed, ones they'd opened years ago and never used, and redirected those funds into an education trust for Noah. All legal, all documented, all with Lydia's signature from when they'd first set up the accounts, back when she actually read the paper she signed. He'd pulled their credit reports, cataloged every shared debt, reviewed the mortgage terms, the property tax history, the maintenance costs she'd never paid attention to because that was his job. He'd documented the deferred repairs, the aging HVAC system, the roof that would need replacement in 3 years. Daniel had been a supply sergeant in the Army. His job had been inventory, tracking, making sure nothing disappeared without a paper trail. Some skills, it turned out, transferred well to civilian life. Cliff started typing on his computer, drafting the acceptance letter. "This will be done in 6 weeks if she doesn't push back. You're sure about this?" "I'm sure," Daniel said. He left the office 20 minutes later, the agreement signed and notarized. The afternoon sun cut through the gaps between buildings, throwing slanted shadows across the sidewalk. He walked past the diner where he and Lydia used to have breakfast on Saturdays, back when Noah was still young enough to need a high chair. Past the park where they'd taught him to ride a bike, running beside him until he found his balance and pedaled away, laughing. Memory was a strange thing. It made you think the past had been better than it was. Daniel knew better. He'd seen the erosion happening for years, the slow way Lydia's eyes had started sliding past him instead of landing on him. The way her laughter had grown polite instead of real. The way she'd stopped asking about his day and started filling the silence with TV shows he didn't care about. He'd known this was coming. He just hadn't known when. Now he did. That night, Daniel packed in the guest bedroom while Noah sat on the floor, twisting a shoelace between his fingers. The boy didn't say anything, just watched his father fold shirts and stack them in cardboard boxes salvaged from the grocery store. The room smelled like dust and the lavender sachets Lydia had put in the closet years ago. Daniel had slept here for the last 4 months, ever since the gap between him and his wife had grown too wide to bridge with a mattress. Did I do something wrong? Noah asked finally, his voice small. Daniel stopped folding. He set down the shirt he was holding and sat on the floor next to his son. The carpet was old, worn flat in places from years of foot traffic. He could feel the hard floor beneath it. No, he said, looking Noah in the eye. Some adults forget what matters. They get caught up in wanting things to be different instead of making things better. But that's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Noah's eyes were red but dry. He was holding it together the way 10-year-old boys do when they're scared to seem weak. Mom said you're moving out. She said you wanted your own place. Daniel's jaw clenched. Of course she had. She was already rewriting the story, making herself the one who stayed, who kept the home together, who sacrificed. He could fight it, tell Noah the truth, plant seeds of resentment that would grow for years. But Noah was 10. He needed a father, not a prosecutor. I'm moving out because you're mom and I need some space, Daniel said carefully. But you're coming with me. We'll find a place close to your school. You'll have your own room, everything you need. Why can't we all just stay here? Because sometimes people need to go different directions. And that's okay. What's not okay is making you feel like you have to fix it. Noah nodded, but Daniel could see he didn't really understand. How could he? Daniel barely understood it himself, and he was the one living through it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, the paper worn soft from being carried around for 3 days while he worked up the nerve to do this. Inside was a photocopy of his old savings account statement, the one from 12 years ago when he'd first started saving for the house. The balance had been small then, built from paychecks and overtime and every dollar he could squeeze out of his GI Bill housing stipend. Why are you giving me this? Noah asked, turning it over in his hands. So, you know where things started, Daniel said. And so you never forget how fast they can disappear if you're not paying attention. Noah frowned, reading the numbers without really understanding them. He would someday. That was the point. Keep it safe, Daniel said, standing up and returning to his packing. Along with your baseball cards. The things you protect are the things that matter. They finished packing in silence. The only sound the rustle of clothes and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Lydia was out, probably at her sister's place, celebrating her newfound freedom with wine and validation. Daniel didn't hate her. Hate required energy, attention, emotional investment. He'd simply run out of all three. When the last box was taped shut, Noah stood in the doorway, small and uncertain. Where's Mom? Out, Daniel said. Is she coming back to say goodbye? Daniel looked at his son, at the hope still flickering in his eyes despite everything. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere without you. Noah nodded and went to his room. Daniel heard the door close, heard the muffled sound of the boy crying when he thought no one could hear. Daniel sat on the edge of the stripped bed and looked at the empty walls. Tomorrow he'd load the truck. He'd sign the final papers. He'd move into the duplex he'd rented on the other side of town, the one with thin walls and a landlord who didn't fix things unless you called 3 times. And Lydia would keep this house, the house he'd rebuilt board by board. She'd keep the SUV he'd maintained, the savings he'd accumulated, the life he'd built. She thought she'd won. Let her think that. Daniel had learned patience in the army, in the desert, in the long hours of watching supply lines and waiting for orders. He learned that the people who talk loudest usually have the least to say. The ones who move first often move wrong. So he'd wait. He'd work. He'd take care of his son. And when the consequences of Lydia's choices finally arrived at her door, he'd be exactly where he needed to be. Nowhere near her. The county courthouse sat in the center of downtown, a gray stone building with columns that were supposed to look important, but mostly just looked old. Daniel climbed the steps on a Thursday morning in October, the air cold enough to see his breath but not cold enough for snow. Not yet. He wore the same suit he'd worn to his father's funeral 3 years ago, the fabric still fitting but feeling heavier somehow, like grief had a weight that didn't wash out. Noah was at school, spared from this part. Daniel had made sure of that. Inside, the hallway smelled like floor polish and stress. People sat on benches outside courtrooms, some crying, some staring at phones, all of them waiting for their turn to have a judge decide how their life would be rearranged. Lydia stood near the courtroom door with her attorney, a woman named Rebecca Walsh, who wore expensive shoes and had the kind of confident smile that came from winning more often than losing. Lydia's sister stood beside her, whispering encouragement, touching her arm in that supportive way that made Daniel's jaw tighten. Lydia looked good, hair done, makeup applied. She dressed for victory. When she saw Daniel, her expression shifted. Not quite guilt, not quite triumph. Something in between, like she was still trying to convince herself this was the right thing. "Daniel," Rebecca said, walking over with papers clutched in a leather portfolio. "We're ready to proceed whenever you are." "I'm ready," Daniel said. Cliff appeared at his elbow, carrying a worn briefcase that had probably been present for 1,000 divorces just like this one. "Last chance to fight this," he muttered. "I'm not fighting," Daniel replied. They entered the courtroom, and the formality of it struck him the way it always did. The judge's bench elevated like an altar, the state seal on the wall, the American flag in the corner. All the symbols meant to remind you that this was serious, that decisions made here carried weight. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman in her 60s who'd been handling family law for longer than Daniel had been alive. She reviewed the settlement agreement with the kind of methodical attention that suggested she'd seen every trick, every loophole, every desperate attempt to game the system. "Mr. Hargreave," she said, looking at him over her reading glasses, "you're agreeing to full physical custody of the minor child, Noah Hargreave, age 10. You're relinquishing claim to the marital home, the vehicle, and approximately 80% of marital assets. Do you understand these terms?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're entering this agreement voluntarily, without coercion?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge looked at him for a long moment, and Daniel wondered what she saw. A fool? A coward? A man who'd given up? Or something else? "Very well," she said finally. She signed the papers with a pen that clicked loudly in the quiet room. "This settlement is approved. Divorce will be finalized in 90 days, pending completion of all financial transfers." That was it. 15 years, compressed into 15 minutes. Lydia smiled. She squeezed Rebecca's hand, and her sister hugged her, whispering something that made Lydia laugh, a bright, relieved sound that echoed in the courtroom like wind chimes. Daniel felt nothing. No anger, no regret, just the cold clarity of knowing exactly what he'd done and why. Outside, Cliff shook his head. "You just let her take everything." "No," Daniel said quietly. "I just let her think I did." The duplex Daniel rented sat 3 blocks from Noah's elementary school, a single-story building with white siding that had yellowed with age and a front porch just big enough for 2 chairs. The landlord, an older man named Frank who owned half the rental properties in town, had given him a decent rate because Daniel paid 3 months up front and didn't complain about the water heater's tendency to run cold after 10 minutes. The place had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that smelled permanently like the fried onions from whoever had lived there before. But the floors were clean, the locks worked, and it was quiet. That mattered more than square footage. Daniel set up Noah's room first. The boys' baseball cards went on a shelf Daniel built from planks and cinder blocks. The bed faced the window, so Noah could see the street, see the neighborhood, see that they were still connected to the world even if it looked different now. "It's smaller than my old room," Noah said that first night, standing in the doorway with his backpack still on. "It is," Daniel agreed. He didn't lie to the boy. That was a rule he'd made early. "But it's yours. You get to decide what goes in it." Noah walked in slowly, testing the space. He touched the wall like he was checking if it was real. Then he set his backpack down and started unpacking, pulling out clothes and books and the worn baseball glove Daniel had given him last summer. They fell into a routine quickly because Daniel believed in routines. Wake at 6. Breakfast by 6:30. School by 7:45. Daniel worked the early shift at the distribution warehouse where he'd been employed for 7 years, moving freight and managing inventory. The pay was decent, the benefits were solid, and the work kept him strong. He picked Noah up at 3:15. Homework at the kitchen table while Daniel made dinner. Simple meals. pasta, tacos, grilled chicken with rice. Nothing fancy, but Noah never complained. At night, after Noah was asleep with the hallway light on just the way he liked it, Daniel sat at the table with his files. He'd organized everything. Joint credit cards that still carried balances. The mortgage on the house, which was larger than Lydia probably remembered because they'd refinanced 5 years ago to pay for her sister's medical bills. The deferred maintenance costs, new HVAC, roof repairs, plumbing issues in the main bathroom. He had estimates, invoices, receipts. He tracked the property taxes, which had increased every year. The insurance, which had jumped after the county reassessed the flood risk. The HOA fees that Lydia had always dismissed as just part of home ownership, without understanding what they actually cost. Daniel didn't touch anything. He didn't call Lydia, didn't send angry texts, didn't try to warn her. He just waited. Within 4 months, the cracks began to show. The first time Lydia called him, it was late January. The phone buzzed on Daniel's nightstand at 9:30, and he almost didn't answer. But Noah was asleep, and Daniel had learned that ignoring problems didn't make them disappear, it just made them louder. Daniel, Lydia's voice sounded strained. Not quite desperate, but close. I need to ask you something. He waited. The house insurance, she continued. It's higher than I thought. I don't remember it being this much. It's not, Daniel said evenly. It's the same as it's been for 3 years. You never looked at the bills. Silence on the other end. He could hear her breathing, hear something playing on TV in the background. A voice he didn't recognize. Maybe her sister. Maybe someone else. You never told me how expensive this place really is, she said finally, and there was an accusation buried in the words. Like this was somehow his fault. You never asked, Daniel replied. The line went dead. He set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, at the water stain that looked like a map of somewhere he'd never been. He didn't feel satisfaction, didn't feel vindication, just the steady awareness that gravity still worked the way it always had. The second call came in February. The furnace had broken, and the repair estimate was $1,800. Lydia wanted to know if he'd split the cost since it was technically their house. It's your house, Daniel said. The settlement was finalized. But you lived here too. You used the furnace. And I paid for its maintenance for 12 years. Now it's your responsibility. She hung up before he could say anything else. The third call came in March. Property taxes were due, and the bill was higher than expected. She'd missed the deadline for the early payment discount. Late fees had accrued. Daniel listened, said nothing, and let her figure it out on her own. By April, Lydia had stopped calling. She'd learned what Daniel had known from the beginning. Ownership wasn't the same as victory. Having something and being able to keep it were two very different things. He heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd picked up extra shifts at the medical office where she worked, that her sister had moved back in with her to help with expenses, that she'd listed the SUV for sale and was driving a 10-year-old sedan instead. Daniel didn't feel good about it, but he didn't feel bad either. He'd given her exactly what she wanted. The consequences were hers to carry. Noah adjusted better than Daniel had hoped. The boy made friends at school, joined the baseball team, stopped asking when they'd go back to the old house. One evening in late April, they sat on the porch eating ice cream from the gas station down the street. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Daniel of dust storms in Afghanistan, though he didn't say that out loud. Mom called yesterday, Noah said quietly. She wanted to know if I wanted to come stay with her this weekend. Daniel took a bite of his ice cream and waited. I said no. Noah continued. Is that okay? That's your choice, Daniel said. I won't make you see her if you don't want to, but I won't stop you either. Noah nodded, stirring his ice cream into soup. She sounded tired. People get tired, Daniel said, especially when they take on more than they can carry. Like the house. Like a lot of things. They finished their ice cream in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. In the distance, someone was mowing their lawn, the engine's sound fading as they moved away. A dog barked. A car passed, headlights cutting through the growing dark. Inside, Daniel had set aside an hour for organizing more paperwork. There were still loose ends to track, accounts to close, documents to file. He worked on it the way he'd worked on supply inventories in the Army, methodically carefully, making sure nothing was overlooked. Because this wasn't over yet. Lydia had what she wanted, but what she wanted was about to cost her more than she could afford. And when that bill came due, Daniel would be exactly where he'd planned to be all along. Far enough away that her problems couldn't reach him. Close enough to his son that nothing else mattered. The certified envelope arrived at Lydia's door on a Tuesday morning in late May, delivered by a postal carrier who waited for a signature because this was the kind of letter that required proof of receipt. Lydia signed for it in her bathrobe, coffee still steaming on the counter inside, and felt the first flutter of unease when she saw the return address. It was from a financial institution she half remembered, one of those places that handle mortgages and refinancing and all the paperwork she'd always left to Daniel because numbers gave her headaches. She tore open the envelope standing in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd told Daniel she wanted a divorce 9 months ago. Funny how time moved. Felt like forever. Felt like yesterday. The letter was 3 pages long, dense with legal terminology and official stamps that made everything look more complicated than it probably was. She skimmed it once, frowning. Then again, slower, her heart starting to pound. The refinancing application she'd submitted 4 weeks ago had been denied. Denied. The words sat on the page like a judgment. The bank had reviewed her application, assessed the property value, examined the outstanding mortgage balance, and determined that she did not have sufficient equity or income to qualify for the refinancing she'd been counting on. Lydia's hands started to shake. She needed that refinancing, needed it to consolidate the credit card debt that had ballooned over the winter, to cover the furnace repair she'd put on a high-interest card, to create breathing room in a monthly budget that kept shrinking no matter how carefully she tried to stretch it. She read further, her eyes catching on phrases that didn't make sense. Outstanding liens on the property. Joint account obligations not disclosed in original application. Insufficient documentation of sole income source. Wait, joint accounts? Lydia grabbed her phone and scrolled through her banking apps, pulling up statements she hadn't reviewed in months, because why would she? The money had always been there. Daniel had handled the finances, transferred funds, paid bills, and she'd trusted that it was all being managed. That's when she saw it. Several accounts she'd assumed were joint, accounts with decent balances she'd been counting on, were marked as closed. Not frozen. Not restricted. Closed. She opened her laptop and logged into the financial portal they'd set up years ago. Her password, still saved from the last time she'd checked balances to buy new furniture for the living room. The account history loaded slowly, and when it did, Lydia felt her stomach drop. The account had been closed 18 months ago, long before the divorce. Daniel had systematically shifted funds out of joint savings and into something called an educational trust for Noah Hargreave. Every transaction was documented, time-stamped, authorized. Authorized by signatures she recognized as her own. She tried to remember. Had she signed papers? She must have. Daniel had always brought documents to her with little yellow tabs marking where she needed to sign, and she'd sign them because she trusted him, because she was busy, because managing money was boring and he was good at it. Lydia called Rebecca Walsh, her attorney, and tried to keep her voice steady while explaining the situation. Rebecca listened, asked questions, requested copies of the documents. "I'll review everything," Rebecca said finally. "But Lydia, if you signed authorization forms for these account changes, and if the transfers were made before divorce proceedings began, there's not much we can do. It's not fraud if you gave permission. But I didn't know what I was signing. That's not a legal defense. You had an obligation to read what you signed." The words hit like cold water. Lydia set the phone down and stared at the letter again, at all the official language that translated to, "You're on your own." She thought about calling Daniel, demanding answers, accusing him of deception, of hiding things, of setting her up. But she already knew what he'd say. He'd say she had access to everything, that all the account statements came to the house, that she could have reviewed them anytime she wanted, that he'd never hidden anything, she'd simply never bothered to look. And he'd be right. Lydia sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers she didn't fully understand, and felt the weight of what she'd done settling over her like snow in winter, slow, inevitable, suffocating. She'd wanted the house, the stability, The proof that she'd won, that she'd chosen herself, that she deserved better. Instead, she'd inherited a mortgage she couldn't refinance, maintenance costs she couldn't defer, and the growing realization that ownership without capability was just another form of drowning. 6 weeks later, Lydia stood in the same courtroom where her divorce had been finalized, but this time she wasn't smiling. Her sister wasn't with her. Rebecca Walsh stood beside her, professional but tired, like they'd already fought this battle and lost before even entering the room. Judge Morrison reviewed the motion Lydia had filed requesting modification of the settlement based on undisclosed financial circumstances. The judge's expression suggested she'd seen this exact scenario play out 100 times before. "Ms. Hargreave," the judge said, and it took Lydia a moment to remember that she'd kept his name because changing it back felt like admitting defeat in a different way. "You're alleging that your ex-husband engaged in financial misconduct by closing joint accounts and transferring assets without your knowledge." "Yes, Your Honor," Lydia said. Her voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat. "He moved money into accounts I didn't know existed. He closed accounts I thought we still had. I signed papers, but I didn't understand what they were." "Did you read the papers before signing them?" Lydia hesitated. Not carefully. "Did you have an opportunity to read them?" "Yes, but—" "And were you under duress when you signed them? Was there coercion? Threats? Any circumstance that would have prevented you from reviewing documents before authorizing them?" Lydia looked at Rebecca, who gave the smallest shake of her head. They'd been over this. There was no legal ground to stand on, but Lydia had insisted on trying anyway, because the alternative was accepting that she'd done this to herself. "No, Your Honor," Lydia said quietly. Judge Morrison looked at Daniel, who sat at the other table with Cliff Renner. Daniel's expression was neutral, neither smug nor apologetic. He simply waited. "Mr. Hargreave," the judge said, "were these account changes made with your ex-wife's authorization?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied. "Every transfer was documented and signed off by both parties. The educational trust for our son was established 3 years ago, and both of us reviewed and approved the terms." "Do you have documentation?" Cliff pulled a folder from his briefcase and handed copies to the court clerk, who passed them to the judge. Lydia watched as Judge Morrison reviewed page after page of forms, signatures, account statements. All legitimate, all legal, all authorized. "Ms. Hargreave," the judge said finally, setting the papers down. "I understand that this situation is financially difficult for you. However, these transfers were made legally, with your documented consent, years before divorce proceedings began. There is no evidence of fraud, coercion, or misconduct." "But he knew," Lydia said, her voice rising despite herself. "He knew this would happen. He planned it. He prepared," the judge corrected, her tone firm but not unkind. "That's not the same thing. You had access to all account information. You received statements. You signed authorization forms. The responsibility to understand what you're agreeing to rests with you." Lydia felt her eyes burn, but she refused to cry. "Not here. Not in front of Daniel. Your motion is denied," Judge Morrison continued. "The settlement stands as finalized. This matter is closed." The gavel came down with a sound like a door slamming shut. Lydia walked out of the courtroom, feeling smaller than when she'd entered. Rebecca touched her arm in sympathy, said something about appealing, but they both knew there was nothing to appeal. The law didn't care about what she'd assumed or hoped or believed would happen. The law cared about what was written down, and Daniel had written everything down perfectly. Outside, the June sun was bright and hot, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer. Lydia stood on the courthouse steps and watched Daniel leave with Noah, the boy's hand his father's, both of them walking toward a truck that Daniel had bought with cash 3 months ago. Noah glanced back once. He didn't wave. Lydia realized, standing there alone, that she couldn't remember the last time her son had called her just to talk. The last time he'd asked to stay over. The last time he'd seemed happy to see her. She'd thought winning the house meant keeping her family. Instead, she traded her son for square footage she couldn't afford. A year passed the way time always did. Slowly when you're counting it, quickly when you look back. Lydia moved out of the house in August, the sale forced by mounting debt, and a refinancing option that never materialized. The realtor assured her she'd get a decent price despite the market softening, and she did. Enough to pay off the mortgage, settle the credit cards, and walk away with almost nothing. She rented a townhouse on the west side of Maple Run, a two-bedroom place with thin walls and a landlord who raised rent every year like clockwork. She worked longer hours at the medical office, picking up overtime when she could, but money still felt scarce in a way it never had before. Her sister had moved out in April, reconciling with her ex-husband and relocating to Cleveland. The book club friend who'd encouraged Lydia to choose herself had also moved away, her own life having imploded in ways that made Lydia's situation look stable by comparison. Lydia saw Noah once a month now, usually for a Saturday lunch that neither of them seemed to enjoy. The conversation was polite, careful, like they were distant relatives instead of mother and son. He talked about school, about baseball, about movies Daniel had taken him to see. He never talked about her. In October, Lydia drove past the old house on her way to the grocery store. New people lived there now, a young couple with a baby and a dog that barked in the yard. They'd repainted the porch, planted flowers, put up a swing set. The house looked happy. Lydia kept driving. Daniel stood in the kitchen of the duplex, packing Noah's lunch for school. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, chips, a juice box. The routine was so ingrained now that he could do it half asleep, which he sometimes did on mornings when his shift started at 5 and Noah needed to be up by 6:30. The place still smelled like fried onions sometimes, especially when the weather changed, but they'd made a home. Noah's room was covered in posters now, baseball players, bands, a map of the United States where he marked places he wanted to visit someday. They'd been here a year and a half, long enough that the neighbors knew them, long enough that the landlord, Frank, had stopped raising their rent because Daniel always paid on time and fixed things himself. "Dad," Noah called from his room. "Have you seen my math folder?" "Check your backpack," Daniel replied, closing the lunchbox and setting it by the door. He heard rustling, a triumphant "found it," and then Noah appeared, backpack slung over one shoulder, hair still messy from sleep. "Mom texted last night," Noah said casually, grabbing his lunch. "She wanted to know if I wanted to come over this weekend." "What did you say?" "I said I had a game on Saturday." "Which is true." Daniel nodded, not pushing. Noah was old enough now to make these decisions, and Daniel had learned that forcing the issue only made things harder. "You know you can see her if you want to," Daniel said. "I'm not stopping you." "I know," Noah replied. He hesitated at the door, then added, "But I don't really want to." "Is that bad?" Daniel considered how to answer that. He could say yes, that family was important, that forgiveness mattered. He could push Noah toward maintaining a relationship with his mother, even though Lydia had made it clear through her actions what she valued most. But Daniel had promised himself he'd never lie to his son. "No," he said finally. "It's not bad. You get to decide who you spend your time with. Just make sure you're making that choice for the right reasons." "What's the right reason?" "Being honest with yourself about what you need." Noah thought about that, then nodded and headed out the door. Daniel watched him walk to the bus stop, watched him join the group of kids who lived on the block, watched the bus pull up and take them all away toward whatever the day held. Then he grabbed his keys and headed to work. That evening, after dinner and homework, they sat on the porch with ice cream again. It had become their ritual, weather permitting, a way to mark the end of the day, to transition from obligation to rest. "Do you ever miss Mom?" Noah asked suddenly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He watched a car pass, headlights cutting through the twilight. A couple walked their dog down the sidewalk, the leash slack between them, comfortable. "I miss who I thought she was," Daniel said finally. "But people show you who they really are when you let them choose. Your mom made her choice. I made mine. You chose me," Noah said, and it wasn't a question. "Every time," Daniel replied. They finished their ice cream as the streetlights flickered on, buzzing to life one by one down the block. Inside, Daniel had paperwork waiting, bills to pay, accounts to balance, the ongoing inventory of life that never stopped requiring attention. But for now, he sat with his son and watched the world darken into night, content in the knowledge that he'd done exactly what he set out to do. He'd protected what mattered. Lydia had the house. Then she didn't. She'd had the car, the money, the victory she'd celebrated in that courtroom 18 months ago. But Daniel had Noah. He had peace. He had the quiet certainty that comes from knowing you play the long game and won not by taking, but by letting go of everything that didn't matter. Karma wasn't a dramatic reckoning. It wasn't thunder and lightning and people getting what they deserved in obvious ways. It was subtle, patient, inevitable. It was Lydia working overtime in a townhouse she didn't want, realizing too late that stability couldn't be taken. It had to be built. It was Noah choosing his father not because he was told to, but because trust, once broken, took more than time to repair. It was Daniel sitting on a porch that didn't belong to him, with a son who did, knowing that the greatest revenge wasn't punishment. It was simply letting someone live with the consequences of their own choices, and finding peace in spite of them.